Hi everyone, this is Espen Sjoberg from Kristiania University College of Applied Sciences in Bergen. I'm here to talk to you about PUBG tournaments. I'm really sorry this ends up being a video. I had massive technical issues that no idea what happened there, but anyway, here I am on a recording and you can enjoy me in the break. Have a nice break and enjoy some more talks. I'm here to talk about PUBG and tournament structures and how we can try and predict who's going to win and get to grand finals of tournaments. I'm going to just hop into it and explain the details as I go along. Now, first off, I have a research group called ACE. That's not a coincidence. That is esports related. It stands for Art, Cognition, and Esports. So it's esports, that was esports. And our main research area is esports and gaming psychology. We also do other things like psychology, cognition, art history, and many other things, but primarily is esports. And this is a research group that's open to everyone. You feel free to contact me if you would like to be part of it. We have meetings at least once a term, although at the moment there'll be a little hiatus because I'm going on paternity leave. But we do it on Zoom, so we can be anywhere and attend. And you can talk about esports research or gaming research or anything in between. So let me know if you want to be part of that. Okay. Let's talk about PUBG. So we're going to talk a little bit about PUBG and how we can try and predict who's going to perform well in the tournament. So if you don't know what PUBG is, I assume most of you do, but in case you don't, it's a battle royale survival shooter, arguably the first of its kind, or at least the first impactful of its kind, released in 2017. And it's basically a battle royale where the last man or team wins. The game is roughly 30 minutes long. At regular intervals, it will shrink, like the map will shrink. You have these circles that start appearing, and these circles get smaller and smaller and smaller as the map progresses. And if you're not inside the circle, you take damage and eventually die. So it forces teams to interact with each other. And in squad mode, there's 4 players per team and 16 teams per round, so 64 players in total. If you solo, it's 100 players, but what we're talking about is team efforts. And we're going to look at how you win, basically. And PUBG Esports is an interesting thing. When it first was announced, I thought that's never going to work. Too many people to track, but actually it does work. It works really well. And, spectators have been significantly improved on how good they are tracking things. Now, there's a lot of different PUBG tournaments, but the main ones follow the official PUBG esports circuit, which is led out by the developers, Crafton. The main one is the Global Championship, which is the World Championship, which tends to have about $1.5 million in prize money. And you get there by getting points, which you achieve through regional qualifiers or international tournaments. There's different regions. There's the European and Middle East. There's APAC or Asia Pacific, the Americas, China, Korea. And I think there's some other routes as well. And they all eventually converge at this point, basically. They also have PGS, which is kind of like majors. These are held throughout the year, but 4 per year. They usually spread about 4 across the whole year, but now they do it in 2s. They do 2 back-to-back, and then they have a qualifier and then another 2. So it's a bit strange how they've done it this year, but it doesn't matter. They're small international tournaments, about 300,000 each. And then you have PUBG Nations, which is the other World Championship, but here instead of teams, you have countries. And this is very popular, so they've increased it a lot this year. And the one we're going to be looking at is the Global Championship. We could look at anything, but we're going to look at this one because it provides the easiest or most interesting data. So what we're looking at, what makes a finalist? What makes it that someone becomes a grand finalist in the World Championship in PUBG? And our primary interest here is actually fatigue. And when I say fatigue, I don't mean necessarily someone getting tired, such directly, or stressed. It's more that does playing more matches in a tournament make you more or less likely to win? Because depending on how you perform in a tournament, you might have to play many matches to get to the grand final or few. And which one is best? There's a lot of research to do with fatigue. Like if you play too much, you have reduced executive functioning and planning. You get health issues like blurry vision, depression, loss of focus. So playing too many matches, even if this research isn't directly to esports, does suggest that you have a disadvantage, basically. So the study we're talking about here is a larger study that's currently in development here at the ACE Research Group, that I call the Extra Effort Effect in Esports, or the E4 study, or Esports. I'll provide suggestions here. And this looks at large data sets to do with performance in various tournaments. But focusing on PUBG just because it's easy to track, but there's a lot of other games you could do this in. Okay, I'm just shooting through this here. So the tournament structure of PUBG is unusual because it's quite interesting. When we have regular tournaments like the majors, it's pretty much the same thing all the time. They have groups and then grand finals and that sort of thing. But in the World Championship, they have a very strange structure that changes every single year. And they've tried to be quite creative about it, which is interesting. And that causes a great variety in how many matches are played for each team, depending on how you perform in the tournament. By far, my favorite one has to be PUBG 2022, which had this crazy tournament structure, which I want to briefly talk about. But basically, you had group stages, and then you advanced to winners brackets and losers bracket. Okay, nothing unusual there. But if you won the losers bracket, you then go into another losers bracket, which comprised of that one and the previous winners bracket, 4 teams which advanced to the grand final. But if you didn't, you went to another round called the grand survival, where if you won that round, you would advance to the grand final. But if you didn't win, you wouldn't. So you could effectively go through. Effectively, you could play, I think that would amount to 24 matches, and you could reach the grand final. If you went the winner's route. If you went the other route, it would be something like double that almost. So it's a huge variety in how many ways this is played. And I appreciate the creativity here, which is, but it's an interesting look at fatigue. So the dominant variable, though, however, to look at when you're looking at whether someone's tired or not and whether it impacts whether they reach a final or not, is the winners-losers bracket. So if you're in the winners bracket, you tend to play fewer matches because you skip a lot of the hassle of getting to the grand final. So you have more time to practice and relax. Although, of course, a lot of teams spend their time watching the other people fight for survival, right? But if you have teams in losers brackets, they tend to play more matches, which could be tiring, but could also give them experience in the tournament itself. And of course, this is all on site, right? So this, of course, is a dissonance between the two. And that can lead you to make 2 opposing arguments. One is that a team that advances to the grand final through the losers bracket has played more matches, which creates more fatigue in opposition, and are therefore less likely to win. Basically, by the time you get to the grand finals, you're playing more matches than everyone else, and you're more tired, you're a bit worn out, and therefore you're less focused, and you're not likely to win. The counter-argument would be that if you do this, you actually get more experience, more practice, you spend more time with the equipment and the arena, with the audience, and you just get more used to it and more warmed up, so to speak, so you might be more likely to win. So which one is correct, right? They can't both be correct. This study here I'm going to show you today is mostly, you should really, at least at the moment, you should consider it a exploratory study. We did have hypothesis, but I don't have all the data for you at the moment, so think of it as something that's exploratory at the moment. Okay, so the current study, we looked at data from PGC, so that's the World Championship of 2023 and 2024. We tried to predict 2 different things. One was what predicts your final placement in the tournament, and what predicts you qualifying for the grand finals. And there's a ton of variables here, only some of which have been calculated. Some of the data we can actually collect from other sources, but some we have to make ourselves. And there's things like number of matches played, the route taken, did you go through losers bracket, winners bracket, and what placement you did in the group qualifiers. Like, did it matter how well you did in group, for example? Now, regrettably, I was planning on showing you data from both these tournaments because they are completely different in their structure. However, due to circumstances beyond my control, like illness and also some paternity leave and some other things, I haven't gotten around to sufficiently analyzing the 2024 data. So I can only actually show you the data from PGC 2023. It should still give you an inkling of how this works, though, and the general gist of how we can predict winners and finalists in a tournament, but you have to take it with a pinch of salt. I decided to present this, even though it's incomplete, because it will showcase the project. It will also give you a clue of what variables matter, and also I'm open to feedback. I'm very happy to take suggestions on how to improve data collection, how to improve data analysis. We're just using regression mostly, but if anyone have any thoughts on any of this, I'm more than happy to listen. Okay. With all that being said, this is talk briefly about the structure. This is the PGC 2023 structure, which is the one we're going to look at today. And the structure here is very standard. This one is the most normal tournament structure that PUBG has had, I think, in a grand final, where you have group stages, Group A and B, and the top 8 teams, the 16 in each, top 8 goes to winners bracket, and bottom 16 go to the losers bracket. If you lose here, you're just out, and that's it. If you win, however, you go to the last chance, which you could also think of as losers bracket 2. And of course, the ones who didn't advance from winners bracket also go here. Effectively, what this really boils down to is that you either played 24 matches to get to the grand finals, or you played 32. That's pretty much the only difference. 36, I must say 36. So you played 12 matches extra if you had to go through the last chance qualifying. So then the question effectively boils down to whether or not you entered this route. If you were the winners bracket straight there, or you had to go through this one, does that impact it in any way? Because you have to play more matches that way. That's basically what we're asking here. By contrast, I'm not going to show the data for this, but PG 2024, which is still being analyzed, had this also a crazy system which allowed for extreme data analysis with performance because of the way they did it. They used what's called a circuit system, which was quite well received by audience. I really liked watching this system, but players hated it. They didn't. So what happened here, this is a bit complicated, but basically what happened is that you play in a circuit, you play 3 days of matches. And what they did is that on day 1, if you're in the bottom 4 teams, you were out of that circus. And then the next day, they inserted the next 4 teams that were good. Like, think of it as seeds, right? Seeds 5 to 8 would then enter, and then the same thing. And day 3, seeds 1 to 4 would enter, and and then on day 2, then the next circuit, what they would do basically was the 16 worst teams would compete, and then the bottom 4 were out. The next day, the top 5 to 8 placement from the day before enters the ring, and they play. Bottom 4 are out, and then the third day, the top 4 from the previous circuit enter. So it's a bit complicated, you see what I mean? But the point here is that only performance on day 3 in each given circuit actually gave points that qualified you for the grand final. This means effectively, especially if you were high seeded at the beginning of the tournament, you could, I think there's 6 matches per day. It meant that effectively you could reach the grand final by playing 18 matches, or you have to do triple that. That also meant that there are some teams that will go through day 1 and 2 and then get disqualified. So they will play 12 matches and get 0 points, while some teams will play 6 matches and get 100 points. You see what I mean? So this structure was very bizarre. But it was fun to watch, though. But data analysis is still ongoing here, so I can't show it to you. But the tournament structure itself in PUBG would warrant its own research article, I think, because it's so crazy how they changed it up like this. Anyway, so the data for this study, we're going to look at the 2023 one, which is the most standard of the 2. The data is taken from Twire, which is this tracker for PUBG data. There's many other trackers as well. And there's a lot of other variables here that we had to calculate ourselves, and there's some that are still ongoing. But basically, we can calculate the number of matches, the position, the route they took, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of things you can look at here. Okay, so let's just hop right into the result and not waste time talking about this anymore. So in the PGC 2023, there were 32 teams, and you can actually see the placements. Because the way you do it is that if you say went to losers bracket and you got disqualified because you didn't advance, right? You were in the bottom 8 teams, then you were out. But you still had a placement within that rank. So if you were on 16th place in the losers bracket, that means that you were in the 32nd place. So it's possible to say precisely what placement each team ended up in, right? And it turns out that if you look at all the teams in the tournament, the final placement was significantly predicted by the matches played. Where the more matches played, the higher your placement was. It also was determined by the route taken, where if you took the winners bracket route, particularly if you took one without going through last chance, basically the fewer matches you played in that sense also predicted your placement. And also the way you placed in your group, the better you did in your group, the higher you had your final placement, and also group set. It turned out, but for some reason in this tournament, if you're in Group A, you just had it going. In the grand final, there were 16 teams, 11 of which came from Group A. So if you're in Group A, you just dominated the whole thing. Now, this is interesting enough, but actually this doesn't really tell us much because of how the data is distributed. For example, if you were in the losers bracket and were eliminated, you actually only played 24 matches. While if you advanced, you played 36 matches. So it's kind of like it's a bit of autocorrelation here. It doesn't really make sense because of the nature of how teams progress. So these are interesting data, but they don't really tell us anything. It's a bit like saying that winners bracket teams significantly played fewer matches. Well, of course they did, because they went through winners bracket. So it doesn't really make any difference. What we really want to do instead is talk about the grand finalists. What predicts qualification to grand finals? Well, there's two things that predicts whether you get to the grand finals or not. One is your group placement, so how well you did in the group predicts it. But the main predictor is the winners bracket. Did you go through winners bracket or not? If you did, you're very likely to make it to the grand finals. And in fact, group placement becomes insignificant when you add it into this factor. However, again, this isn't even that useful because it's in the cards. If you took the winners bracket and ignoring all other variables, you effectively have an extra chance of succeeding. If you lose in the winners bracket, you can still go to lower bracket 2 or last chance. But if you lose in lower bracket, you're out. So it's just the nature of having an extra chance. So of course, it's statistically significant that being in the winners bracket gets you to the grand final. So all of these things, even though they're interesting, they don't really tell us much because all of these conclusions can really be reached just through sheer logic, if I'm honest. So it's not that much interesting. What is interesting is the grand finals themselves. So if you look at the grand finals and you ignore how they got there, because the sheer numbers involved in the structure of a tournament allows you to use logic to dictate who's going to make it. And of course, those who perform better in the group stages will qualify because they reach the upper brackets. See what I mean? So the road to the grand finals is only so interesting. Well, what's interesting is what happens in the grand finals. If you reach the grand finals, then if you were more likely to be from the winners bracket, because winners bracket played less matches, they had more points, and all that makes sense. But what about the performance in the grand finals? But here's the thing. In the actual grand finals themselves, if you look at all the teams that played, it turns out that no predictive variables were significant when you look at only the grand finals teams. The best regression I could do was one that gave an R-square of 18, but it was not significant. So basically, the final placement of a team could not be predicted based on the number of matches or group placement or route taken. Basically, once you reach the grand final, all bets are off. It didn't matter how you got there. It didn't matter if you came there through winners bracket, through losers bracket, if you were at first place or last place in your group, did not make any difference. None of these things could reliably predict how you do in the grand final. They can only predict when you get to the grand final. And then if you have a brief look at this before we run out of time, these are all the data. And you can see, for example, that if you look at group stage placement, you have, for example, Space Station got 14th place in their group, but they ended up in 12th place in the grand finals. You also have Petrichor Road, which got 9th place in their group, had to go through both losers brackets, but they got 4th place overall. The Seven players are new happy, they got 1st place in their group, but they actually had to go through losers bracket because they got last place in the winners bracket. So all this stuff is up in the air and it's really loose. People vary tremendously in their performance. And once you get to the grand final, it's basically as if everything resets. Your previous performance doesn't matter at all. So long story short, basically your matches play or fatigue. Sure, it matters in reaching the grand final and your performance matters in reaching the grand final. But once you are at the grand final, none of the variables actually predict what's going to happen. All of it goes out the window. All bets are off. It doesn't matter how you got to the grand final. It doesn't matter how many matches you played, how well you did in group stages, what route you took to get there. Nothing matters. Everything resets and it's all up in the air. So you cannot predict who's going to win based on previous performance once a team is in the grand final, basically. And PG 24 will come later. I want to say